Okay. All right, great. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. We're going to keep our energy levels up through the last panel of the day, and then we can all break to have a lovely reception afterwards and talk through all of the things that we have learned today. We have a great panel here today. I am Katy Bass, the Research Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute. I will be moderating. Next to me, we have Mike Ananny, who is an Associate Professor of Communication and Journalism and affiliated faculty of Science, Technology, and Society at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. He studies how the cultures that create digital news, algorithmic systems, and AI infrastructures structure public life. And he is the author of the book Networked Press Freedom, Creating Infrastructures for a Public Right to Hear. Then we have my colleague Nadine Farid Johnson, who is the policy director of the Knight Institute. She's responsible for our policy and advocacy efforts, leading engagement with the US government and other officials. She's also a former US diplomat and most recently worked as managing director of PEN America's Washington office, where she co-authored the report Speech in the Machine, Generative AI's Implications for Free Expression. Moving down the row, we have Camille François, who is on the adjunct faculty of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, where she teaches a course on trust and safety. She also runs a trust and safety function at Niantic. She's the chair of the advisory board and the former chief innovation officer at Graphica, where she led the company's work to detect and mitigate disinformation, media manipulation, and harassment. She was also previously a special advisor to the chief technology officer of France in the Prime Minister's office. And finally, we have James Grimmelmann, who is Tesler Family Professor of Digital and Information Law at Cornell Tech and Cornell Law School. He studies how laws regulating software affect freedom, wealth, and power. He helps lawyers and technologists understand each other, applying ideas from computer science to problems in law and vice versa. He's the author of the casebook Internet Law, Cases and Problems, as well as many other articles and essays. So we have the privilege and the challenge of being the final panel of the day, which means we're all trying to incorporate all of the great points that we've already heard. We've also been assigned quite a few tasks by the earlier panels, including fixing our democracy and shoring up our institutions, and restoring public trust. So we have 75 minutes. We're going to do what we can. This panel focuses on what we are calling information integrity and trustworthiness, and something that Bruce touched on in his remarks, I think really rang true to me. One thing I have noticed over the years working on these issues is that, when GPT-3 was released in 2020, it got some media coverage, but it didn't get a ton of media coverage. There were sort of a few stories and there were a few observations of people who had played with the tool and thought, this is cool, it's kind of clunky, it's not very, you can tell it's not a human, and that was that. And then in 2023, GPT-4 comes out and people freak out. And I think the difference, or at least one of the differences, is it sounded human. And we all kind of knew that that was really going to mess with our brains, because we are wired to trust and because we are wired to assume that something that sounds human is human. So to recenter us with this panel, I'm going to talk about public discourse again for a moment. Jamil brought this up at the beginning of the day. What we mean here is something different than just thinking about online speech generally. We're thinking something more specific here and something that's really much more precious in a way. It is the particular kind of speech and debate that has to happen for the members of a democratic polity to decide how they are going to be governed, to exercise self-government. It is debating, it is obtaining new information, trying to figure out what that means for you or your society, arguing about what we should do about it, and trying to find a path forward. It doesn't always mean consensus. No one who has studied the politics in this country and many others recently is ever going to assume we can reach consensus. But it does require certain conditions for us to even engage in that kind of discourse. And as we've talked about a lot today, these models, these generative AI tools, are really going to upend some of what we assume are necessary conditions for that kind of discourse. So here's the roadmap for where I'd like to go over the next hour or so. I'm going to start by briefly asking our panel to identify some of the biggest concerns about how these tools may affect public discourse, specifically right now, rather than some of the longer-term, vague predictions we've heard about existential threats and extinction risks and things like that. But we're going to spend most of our time first looking backwards, then looking forwards. We're going to look to the past to see what sorts of lessons we have learned from past instances of disruptive technology. And then we're going to look to the future and try to think about what we need to do now and in the coming years to establish meaningful public oversight of these tools. For those of you who have been with us, you know how Q&A works, but there's a QR code over there. You can submit questions through Google Form, and they come up to me on this iPad. I will try to work as many of them in as possible. They have been great all day long, so thank you very much for your engagement. So with that, we're going to turn to the present for a few minutes. I'd like to hear what each of you are most concerned about right now in 2024. So trying to leave aside some of the more possible but not necessarily likely things that we're worried about. What are you focused on now? And I'd like you to try to be precise in terms of explaining whether you're worried about something where there's already a danger to discourse that you think generative AI may make worse or may amplify, or whether you're talking about something that you think is a truly new potential harm that generative AI poses. James, would you mind if I start with you and then we'll work backwards?
Sure. I'm most worried about spam. And I'm not just talking about email spam trying to sell you things, but automated attempts to overwhelm any human moderation system. Fake Facebook friends, inauthentic posts on Twitter, review blogs that just synthesize fake reviews of consumer products from their attributes to try to get Google ads. All of these are coming for every human curation institution, from platform content moderation to journalism to informed shopping. And this is going to force us to spend, I don't know how much energy sorting out the authentic from the inauthentic, or simply give up on the platforms we use to talk about everything in society.
Camille.
I have to beat spam. I'm worried about spam too. And building on that, I think I'm worried about, do we have the infrastructure that we need for multiple online spaces to emerge and get ahead of these problems? I think with folks, for instance, moving away from Twitter or finding other places to do social media and new products, there's a need for a more diverse set of more accessible tools for people to be able to tackle spam, tackle child safety issue, do content moderation at scale. And we don't really have this infrastructure well established. So I'm worried about trust and safety infrastructure, really.
Thank you. Nadine.
I'm worried about the elections, not only in the US, all around the world. We know 2024 is a year of elections all across the globe. And specifically, I'm worried about the supercharging of influence operations via AI.
Mike?
Yeah, I would echo, honestly. I think there's a lot of shared perspective on this. I think one of the things I'm worried about is sort of the incredulity of audiences and whether people are able and ready to do this balance between trusting and believing, and we heard about trust earlier, but also not believing and being skeptical and being suspicious. And that's such a delicate balance to strike. But I think, especially in this election year, we need both of those, that balance. And if I could add one other thing I'm a little concerned about too, I'm also worried a little bit about the good enough synthetic media that's put out there. This is, I study journalism and I work with a lot of journalists, and the good journalists I know are really good at honing their craft, their language, using media in very sophisticated, nuanced ways. And I worry a little bit about the good enough ChatGPT response or the good enough Midjourney response that is sort of like, meh, it does the job. And I worried about getting crowded out in that way.
Thank you. I'm just going to add one more to that, sort of building on the skepticism point. I am worried about extreme skepticism, extreme distrust of institutions. We're already at a low ebb in terms of public trust of many institutions. I think this is going to make it worse in the short term, even though I agree with the earlier panel, many of whom thought we're going to hit a learning curve on that, and people will adapt and become better at sorting out true from false information, but we're not going to get there immediately. And then one more thing I'm going to layer on top of that is that our traditional media institutions are in free fall at the moment. That is not the fault of generative AI, but it is something that is really going to impact our ability to respond to it and to deal with some of these issues. Okay, so we've set that on the table. Some of the earlier panels talked about the benefits of generative AI and how those may help democracy. We're not really focused on that right now, but we are going to talk about the tools we already have and the lessons that we have learned. So generative AI is very new, feels very new to the general public if you haven't been studying the development of these tools. But this isn't the first time that we have had to deal with navigating the online information system, trying to help people wade through it. We've had years of trust and safety work aimed at moderating social media platforms, trying to counter or to remove misinformation, focusing on protecting elections. Camille, could I start with you here? What would you point to in our existing tool bag, if anything, that you think would be very helpful to us now?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think we're also standing a little bit on the edge of a cacophony, right? Because we're talking about responsible AI, we're talking about aligning AI, moderating AI, trust and safety in AI. And in reality, all those fields are sort of a little bit different and have overlapping boundaries. And the question is, what out of all we learned from making new technologies more responsible applies neatly in this space? So for instance, we still need to make policies and say that's an acceptable use of the technology or that's not. We still do safety by design efforts, specifically red teaming. So we take a product and we try to figure out how will it be abused. That helps inform malicious uses and understand mitigations. But there's one sort of area in particular that's bound to play a critical role that I don't think would really fully circle around how it's changing with the advent of generative AI, and that's content moderation. Because really when we think about generative AI and content moderation, we use content moderation in most of the generative AI products. For instance, the training data can be moderated. What people type into, for instance, the chatbot interface will be moderated. What a chatbot will speak back, for instance, can be moderated. So it's a different type of moderation. It happens at different parts of the stack. But of course, it's very true that people will use generative AI to change how we do moderation, which is also interesting because, frankly, we've had a very hard time efficiently moderating content at scale. So that's potentially very good news if we can do it right. So I think that here we have sort of a nod that's going to be unpacked in really interesting ways in both how we are concretely applying moderation lessons to generative AI, while generative AI is radically changing the way we go about moderating content.
Great, thank you. James, you've also studied content moderation for a long time. Is there anything you would add there? Any tools that you would reach for here?
I think that you can see this trend in a lot of previous internet technologies for creating and sharing, at which the arrival of some new, increasingly disintermediated way of putting stuff out there leads to a crisis of trust in the mechanisms. So you see this with simple publication on the internet, and there's a sense that, well, not every website is reliable, and people have to sort out the good ones from the bad. Well, one of the things we do with that when we're educating kids in school is, well, you look for these indicia of reliability. Good writing, illustrations that are on point, a professional sounding domain, good layout, and it turns out that, well, people can replicate all of those at scale. And so we're always on a treadmill where people are going to use the latest technology to produce content that is not reliable with all of the superficial hallmarks of it. Generative AI is just the latest in that trend. The other thing I'd point out is that we've had this legitimacy crisis around things like Wikipedia as a repository of knowledge, where people say the process by which this is produced is unreliable. It is not an authority on the details you find there. People can easily go in and edit it. And that reality coexists with the fact that on enormous ranges of topics, a combination of conscientious editing and lack of interest in vandalism results in very high quality content. If you want to get information on the chemical formula of compounds, it's very likely to be right. And on high profile political issues, it's actually quite good because there's so much attention on cleaning it up. The process winds up working, but it's not something you could just have pointed at and said, this is going to happen from a website that anybody can edit. It had to evolve and develop. And if you'd asked people at the moment Wikipedia was launched, can you describe the specific institutions that will or won't make this work? No, couldn't have designed that, couldn't have predicted it. We simply had to live through it.
Nadine or Mike, is there anything you want to add there? All right, well, my next question is for Mike.
Okay.
Mike, you're a communications scholar, and I'm wondering, looking back at past moments where disruptive communications technologies have been introduced, we were talking about the printing press earlier today, but there have been lots of others. What can we learn from those, and does that help us predict anything or expect anything going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's such a communication professor-y kind of question, so it's great. I guess, so the one thing is when we think about what communication is as a field and as what we do it, I often say that it's how people make meaning through media. And that for me is like a phrase I go back to sometimes because it depends on who the people are, what the meanings are that are being struggled for or made with, and the shape of the media. But in all of that, there's the thing we try desperately to do is you always consider the human and the non-human together, the person and the system together, the artifact and the individual, and you never talk about the effect of a technology on society. Like that's sort of bad analytical setup. If you think society is this thing that's out there and technology is a thing that's going to get applied to the society, you're already sort of setting up for, I think, analytical failure because you haven't realized that, well, a couple different things. The people who are making the technologies and using, they are society. There is no separation between these. And then the other bit, and this is cribbing from field science technology studies, which would say those objects, those artifacts, those systems are circulating in a way that they do have a little bit of agency. They have a little bit of role that they play in different social relations. So they are also part of society. So the one big thing we learn repeatedly in sort of historical moments is to try to, as much as possible, always consider the human and the non-human together. It's that relationship that's the thing you want to study. And the other thing that we've sort of seen a lot happen is that there's always this moment of sort of what scholars would call, quote, interpretive flexibility, which is just a fancy word for saying anytime something new gets introduced, there's this bit of this panic and we're all scrambling to make sense of it. Generative AI, we're absolutely in that moment right now. And then what happens is these people, they call them relevant social groups. Anyway, some people get to be part of this conversation and get to be powerful within it, and other people don't get to be. So the one thing I would also say is pay attention to who gets to call this out as a problem. Who gets to participate in saying what parts of the system matter or don't matter? And then the more, ideally you have a very diverse and robust conversation where you actually get to put stakes on the table. You get to say, not just how does it matter for society, but there's so many different answers to that question. So you absolutely need multiple answers. And then there's the last thing I'll say is there's this process they call sort of stabilization or closure, where this, we don't talk anymore about, the radio. What is radio? How is it going to disrupt things necessarily? Or the printed word. Be very wary of moments when it seems like this technological moment is getting stabilized, is getting closed down, and be a little skeptical and suspicious of the forces that caused that stabilization. And if you need to, work your damnedest to open it back up again and say, no, we're not ready for that stabilization. We're not ready for that closure. But there's a lot of people that want this moment to close. They want it to stabilize. And I would say that's our challenge, is to make sure that we have our norms and values, that we pry it open if it seems like it's closing down.
Is there a specific moment of past stabilization of a past technology that you might point to?
It's a bit of a silly one, but actually there's a lot of it. So when telephones were first introduced into the home, highly disruptive moment, because literally you used to know who was coming to the house, right? If like someone would approach and you could see who that person is. Telephone being in the home, who knew who was on the other end of that wire that was coming in? And so one is sort of, there's a suspicion, there's a panic, there's a moment. But the also is look at our social categories. So that was also a highly gendered moment. So there was this massive panic that women especially were going to get information from outside the home. Like,
can't have that.
Oh no, right? We're gonna. By the way, there's a history of the bicycle, which is the same story, because bicycles, women could ride them places and get away, and like were able to travel. I say that it sounds like a silly example, but the point is you can read those moments and say they're moments of social power. They're moments of social practices. They're also moments where we see either the questions of justice or inequality play out in the reactions to these introductions. So in this moment, if you think generative AI is a problem for social democracy, that problem existed beforehand. So what's getting exacerbated? What's getting pried open in that way? It happens all the time.
May I comment on that? I think that's an incredibly important point as a woman who has learned things outside her home and also has ridden a bike on occasion.
A bike too.
Yeah. So, but I think you're making a really important point. And in this context, I know one thing we'll be talking about at some point is the policy aspect of this. And as you were talking about having people in the room, people making the decisions, I think it's critically important, as we've been hearing today, to have the diversity of expertise and the diversity of voices in the room, if you will, because that's what's going to help inform this as we try to take it forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to talk briefly about the First Amendment's role in some of these questions. There are a lot of unanswered questions about how First Amendment doctrine is going to apply to generative AI, and we could spend a whole panel on that, but I don't think that would be as interesting to this audience. So right now I want to hone in on the First Amendment questions whose resolution is going to be the most significant to generative AI's impact on public discourse. James, I'd like to start with you here, and then Nadine, if you want to jump in as well. You know, what's most on your mind, or like, is there a Supreme Court case that you're either hoping or dreading that they're going to take up?
Well, and I'm most worried about the Supreme Court cases on the Texas and Florida social media laws, because those could so fundamentally alter the content moderation and internet landscape that it would make generative AI debates almost irrelevant. But if we're talking about generative AI specifically, I think the threshold question of whether and when the outputs or the process of training a model is protected by the First Amendment matters enormously. Because if the act of gathering sources and creating a model is a First Amendment activity, if that's treated as a kind of editing, it basically means the entire industry is unregulable. And that any attempt to impose transparency or debiasing rules, or even to try to prevent defamation or harmful falsehoods, is doomed at the outset, because so much of it will be shielded by the First Amendment. On the other hand, if you have a situation in which all of this is treated as mere transmission between machines that doesn't implicate human speech. Some people look at the outputs of ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion and say, this is not even speech. This is just the result of running an algorithm. If that's the case, then we're in a situation in which governments can regulate this communication pretty much arbitrarily. So I am actually quite worried about falling off of this tightrope we're on to one side or the other that turns generative AI either into a completely unregulable zone or one in which there is no scope for communicative freedom.
Yeah, I think I agree. And if you're looking at the former point in terms of the potential unregulability, I think that's where we're going to see immense frustration and concern on the part of Congress, because they are trying to come together to figure out some sort of framework. But if they find their hands tied in that way, I think it will have significant consequences. I mean, the biggest thing is what content is going to be protected, if at all, and then who's responsible for it. And if we're talking about litigation, I think there are a couple of interesting cases that I don't think are going to be at Supreme Court level, but I do think it's interesting to see what happens with them. There's a defamation case in Georgia where a radio personality is suing OpenAI, saying that an output from ChatGPT that mischaracterized his role in a fraud situation was defamation. And it survived a motion to dismiss as of just a couple of weeks ago. So I think that's really interesting to see what happens with that. It's in state court. It moved to federal and then back to state. And then there are a couple of cases against Google and Microsoft that are saying that the potential misuse of people's personal information was done without their consent, without their notice. So it's interesting to see what will actually come out of those.
Camille, do you have anything to add here in terms of the European perspective on some of these regulations? In many ways, the EU is leading on regulation in many tech areas right now. Are there any questions you think that they are focusing on that US actors should be more focused on?
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck on Mike's comment on like beware of what types of conversations are also being pushed to a close. And sometimes it does feel that generative AI is here to displace some conversations we were having about the proper handling of social media. And particularly at a moment that feels very pivotal because you have sort of almost two opposing forces, right? In Silicon Valley, we've seen what some people call the Musk effect, right? Elon Musk coming and essentially dismantling entire trust and safety infrastructures, thereby somewhat giving permission to others in Silicon Valley to disinvest themselves from these practices and to sort of question, maybe we did go, too far in, for instance, protecting electoral integrity speech and things like that. So you have sort of a movement that is taking a step back from things that were established as best practices. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, it seems very much quite the opposing forces, right? You have the Brussels effect, the DSA that's just coming in application, and new rules, a series of new rules that are saying, actually, we are going to raise the bar for how content gets moderated. I don't know how that will net out. I think there's a lot of also uncertainties on specific cases in the US. It's really interesting to sort of have that moment where those conversations on how do we moderate content on social media seems so unset, and yet we're so willing to talk about something else that's so deeply linked, of course, because most of those generative AI outputs, that's how they get generated, but where do they get distributed? A lot of that, of course, is getting distributed on social media. So, it's striking to me that we don't really know how that's going to shape the landscape, and it seems like a very pivotal moment. Just a small thing there too, something interesting happened yesterday with a handful of non-huge tech platforms, Discourse and a few others, forming together a coalition to say, actually, there are other platforms that maybe are less central in how we talk about content moderation. Maybe it's not Google and Meta, but they still have a different take, and they still have maybe a different set of interests in advocating for certain moderation practices. So it feels like a very pivotal moment on that topic, yes.
Great. Okay, so one more question on this that I think will bridge us nicely into this sort of future-focused discussion here, but it's a lessons learned question as well. So in a recent Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, a few lawmakers made the point that the internet has been around for over 20 years, and they still haven't been able to find satisfactory regulatory frameworks to rein in the tech companies. So are there any lessons that you would draw from our mostly failed attempts to regulate social media platforms that would be useful to us as we think about governing generative AI? Anybody who wants to go first?
It's extraordinarily frustrating to hear them complain about this when Washington basically took its hands off antitrust enforcement for the past generation. That was a tool purpose-built to prevent the concentration of economic power, and by saying that we're not going to apply it not just to tech, but to any industry, you basically guaranteed that we would have an industry dominated by a few large platforms. So start with antitrust enforcement.
Good. So let's stay on that for a second. So looking at the firms working on these tools now, how do we look at that through an antitrust framework? I mean, there are still mostly a few large companies that are dealing with these technologies. What can we do now?
So most of the companies that are making major AI investments have not done anything really problematic in their creation of AI. But you can imagine quite easily some kind of duty to provide licensing of their models for use on non-discriminatory terms. That would be a start. So if you've trained this really expensive model, it's now an essential facility, and you have to provide it to others on equal terms without imposing your restrictions on it and without using it to leverage your other products. So the exclusive tie-ups that OpenAI is starting to develop with Microsoft would be instantly problematic.
Great. Anyone else want to add on the competition point? Okay. So we're going to spend some more time thinking about future-oriented actions. So we're just at the beginning of the widespread use of these kinds of technologies, and in some ways that does present an opportunity. It's a fresh start for trying to achieve meaningful public oversight of these companies and their influence on our public discourse, even if looking to the past suggests that it's going to be a very difficult road, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Mike, I'd like to ask you to start here because you wrote a piece recently on the importance of thinking of generative AI as a public problem rather than a technical problem that I really appreciated. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, and what does thinking of it this way mean for our approach to these challenges?
Yeah, the reason I wanted to think about that, one was there was a tech executive who sort of said, essentially, only tech understands this well enough to govern this, so let tech do the governing itself, and then we'll periodically report back. And I was like, that's not okay. That's not a bad thing. But it made me think about one of the things we think about in communication a lot too is like, how does something get made to be a problem? So problems are not things that exist naturally in the wild. Like you just don't go find them. You have to make something a problem. And in the fight and sort of the frothiness and turmoil to make something a problem, you discover different kinds of investments or stakes that people have. And so when something is considered a technical problem or a private problem, then already in the setup of that, it says, wow, this is an expertise that you don't have, or this is access to James' point you don't have. So we'll take care of it. But if you can frame it as a public problem, I'm cribbing a little, so John Dewey famously said, a public problem is one about shared consequences that need to be systematically cared for. That's kind of the phrase that he said. And what it means is it doesn't matter, a public problem, it doesn't matter if you're interested in it. It doesn't matter if you want to deliberate about it or not. A public problem is shared consequences that you cannot extract yourself from. So the classic ones are sort of, clean water, clean air, public education, healthcare, where it's like, it doesn't matter how much money you have, although some people are shooting themselves into outer space, but you still have to live on this planet. You still have to deal with it. And the reason I've been thinking about generative AI as a public problem is really its role as language. So its role as meaning making. And to the extent that generative AI is synonymous with language, because it's the words and the perspective and the meaning making that we're going to use to make sense of and discover shared consequences, that is a completely intertwined problem, such that I can't necessarily create an account of the climate crisis that is stepping outside of synthetic media if the systems are so widespread and so embedded in our public discourse systems that I have to have a relationship to generative AI because it's so baked into my journalism or my autocomplete or whatever you want it to be. So that's why I think about it as a public problem, is because it's a shared consequence that has to be systematically cared for, and it just doesn't matter if you're interested in it or not, or you have the expertise or not. It's like one of our other problems because it's language, and language is the stuff we make everything with. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you. So what sorts of forces or organizations or institutions do we need to muster together to approach this as a public problem? How does that look in practice?
Yeah, one I think is, as a journalism professor, I'd be remiss in saying good journalism that understands the power of its words, that also is able to see how the choices that journalism has made about how it uses language over the years. There's been some incredibly powerful language created by journalists that have force change. And I think that's something, so journalists need to sort of own that and say, I'm not in the business of just, providing information and telling, quote, both sides of the story. Journalists are making public life by commanding language. And that's a normative perspective to go back to it with. But I would also say a regulatory approach that understands the power of a media system that is able to look inside the systems that it's using, that's able to see the large language models, that's able to ask hard questions of this language that it's using to create public life. If it can't do that, then we're all just sort of surfing on a whole bunch of decisions that have been made underneath us, and that's a problem. So I would say sort of thinking about professional communities, but also even, literally, this is not too naive to say, but like us, ourselves. Like when I said earlier the good enough problem, I have absolutely looked at that autocomplete and been like, is that word good enough for what I want to do? Okay, like I'm in a rush, I'll go for it. pause, check, ask. Language is powerful. You don't have to take that. You have to sort of, so it's rediscovering your ability to be eloquent by being critical of the starting points and the good enough answers that are maybe given to you is another way.
That's great. Camille?
Yeah, just, building on this, I think something I worry a little bit about is we see very large models emerge, and a few of them seem to be, on a path to sort of dominate the production of Gen AI outputs on our internet. And that I'm worried about because, to your point, we don't want a monoculture of content that's created by a handful of models. I think there's also something to be said for making sure that we have a diversity in the set of tools that are going to bring about this new set of technologies in the hand of the public, right? That's personally why I'm excited, for instance, by open source AI and some models that are training on different data sets, that are prioritizing other types of cultural and linguistic inputs in how they go about building up those models. I think that's also something that we need to keep an eye out on if we look for, the future of a public sphere that reflects real plurality, too.
Great.
If I could say it really quickly, I think that along those lines, one of the things that concerns me, I have a very long list of responses to your first question, Katy, is the fact that the potential for misuse of these tools also lies within authoritarian regimes and the ability to shut off some of these information sources. So I think the open source is really exciting if there can be, especially if there can be access, so that we're not remaking. I mean, we could remake history in some places, right? That certain things never happened, and I think that's really something we should look out for.
James, do you want to add or? Okay. So we've already started teasing some of this out, but I'd like to hear from any of you really. Maybe I'll start with Nadine. Are there policy or regulatory proposals on the table that you find really exciting or promising, or to take a different viewpoint? Is there anything being discussed right now that you think is a dead end that we really should just abandon and move on from?
So I'll start with what I think should have been done quite some time ago, and that's actually reflected in what we're seeing with what's happening in the EU, but I'll look at the US now. If you look at what's come out of the White House most recently, a lot of the discussion, and actually with some discussion about from Congress as well, is about we need to have protection of data, and yet we do not have comprehensive privacy legislation in this country. And so I would say we need to get back to basics that should have been done quite some time ago. So I would talk about privacy legislation. I would look at the platform accountability, transparency, access for researchers, access for journalists. These are things that should form that baseline from which we can operate. And if you look at what's coming in the pipeline, I mean, there are now dozens of bills that have been introduced. Some of them don't even have titles yet. They're just putting it out there. Like, here's my AI bill. It's coming. But if you look at the ones that I think have the most promise, it's where they're trying to look at the idea of transparency, explainability, and informing the public as to what they are seeing, hopefully to help mitigate some of the extreme skepticism that you talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Camille, James, anybody?
Yeah, I like Nadine's baseline. I think we should all build from there, privacy, platform accountability. To your exact prompt on what's the binary that I think dominates a part of this debate, I think about the deepfakes watermarking binary that seems to completely dominate how we think about Gen AI and disinformation or impact on election. It doesn't mean to say that there's no place for watermarking, which is a really interesting technology, but seeing this entire set of complicated issues, impact on election, disinformation, misinformation, through that, deepfakes watermarking spectrum, I think is preventing us from engaging really with a lot of more complicated questions. I think back to testing that Dr. Alondra Nelson and Julia Engwin did recently at Columbia, where they looked at how 5 different chatbots would answer questions related to electoral integrity. Could be questions as simple as to how do I register to vote in this place? And if you look at those issues, specifically, you see that we're still very much struggling to think about what do we want people who will turn to these technologies looking for answers to these questions to actually see, And how do we go about making it happen? We focus so much on the malicious uses and the malicious use cases. They really matter. As somebody who spent a lot of time, working on information operations, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but there's a lot of unintended harms that right now we don't know how to navigate just yet, and we must be able to focus on both at once. Not just the malicious use cases, but the reality of the immense set of unintended harms that are being caused by products being deployed in environments that are completely new for users who don't know what's an appropriate question and what's not an appropriate question in the context of tech companies who have a very hard time finding out the right set of moderation, refusal practices to give trustworthy information at critical times.
Can I jump in with one?
Yeah, please.
I'd be remiss again saying I would echo that and say I think publicly funded media systems that are able to be strong enough institutionally to not be sort of buffered by particular changes in tech, or especially feeling an economic pressure to adopt some new technologies that maybe don't align with journalistic practices or the editorial decisions or workflows that they want to make. With Jake Carr at NYU, we've been talking to journalists and looking at some of the discourse that's been happening. And I think what's been striking is that some news organizations are able to sort of take a beat and pause and not be so immediately influenced by synthetic media production. Other news organizations or other types of journalism, other types of beats are much more susceptible. And some of that's due to the economic stability of the organizations they're in. I live in Los Angeles, and the LA Times had a massive amount of layoffs, and that's a very, very large city that is struggling to be journalistically sound in the way that it can. So I think about that's an institution that regulatory response might seem separate from generative AI, but unless we have news institutions that are strong enough to make independent decisions about whether a new technology is part of their vision for public life or not, or some version of in the middle, we have to allow them to sort of take a beat, take time to make those decisions on principled manners for the right reasons, not feel panicked because they're just trying to make payroll for the next month. And that's a concern I do have.
I think generative AI could play a potentially interesting role in shoring up the breakdown of local news. I mean, I think it's a delicate subject, but I've seen some proposals out there for example, using generative AI tools to summarize records from public meetings, things like that, and in places in various countries where there is no more local media to cover, there is no reporter who's going to go to that meeting. It's a promising tool. It seems wrong to accept that we can't reestablish local media run by journalists, but in terms of some of these positive roles that generative AI might play, that one was intriguing to me.
Yeah, I think it could be. And what I would also love to, I'm also conscious, when I've gone around to local newsrooms, there's, it's basically, I'll say it really bluntly, it can be very lonely to be in a local newsroom trying to do this work all by yourself, figuring out what are the right practices to do it. So to the extent to which we can support and help networks of local news organizations, even when it's like the one-person newsroom, have a sense of when or how could I be using generative AI to do different tasks, and just truly like a sense of professional community around what this moment means for local news is, I think, is needed, rather than just sort of saying they can go get their subscription to ChatGPT. But anyway, it's a different point. Yeah.
I'm going to go back for a second to something Nadine said in terms of transparency, and this came up in a number of the earlier discussions as well. So I'm just wondering, do any of you have thoughts on what kinds of transparency are going to be most helpful here? Like, transparency can mean all sorts of different things. Are there particular subsets of that you want first, or that you would point to as like the things we should really try to set out first?
Yeah, I would say that the starting point is data set transparency. When you have a large model, what was the source of data that was trained on? I'm seeing this through the lawsuits over copyright infringement by AI companies, and those are forcing disclosure in some cases of the training data these models use. The Stable Diffusion lawsuit and the Midjourney lawsuit have led to an understanding of which artists' works have actually been used there. That's a baseline for understanding the scope which models are at. After that, I think the most important thing is probably interactive access to it. One of the challenges of generative AI models is that they're not interpretable by themselves. It's a bunch of numbers that you can prompt in a certain way, and it produces outputs that look meaningful to humans. So you actually have to get in there and feed lots of prompts to it to start to understand what data is actually memorized in there, under what circumstances does it confabulate that data to produce things that never actually happened. What do you have to do to trick it into defying its instructions and producing copyrighted images? All of that requires some kind of interactive access, and sometimes it has to be privileged access because you can't just use the ChatGPT web interface that will stop you from trying to do certain things. Part of the question is what is in there that's only being held back by some possibly very thin guardrails?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Kinds of transparency that we most need? Okay.
No, I already talked a lot.
So I'm looking at some of these audience questions, and a number of people have actually asked about Section 230 and what role we think Section 230 might play when it comes to generative AI. And James, I know you mentioned some of the cases that are coming before the Supreme Court very soon may change a lot of things about the way the law thinks about this whole area. But in terms of what the role of Section 230 will be if we don't upend that area of law in the realm of regulating generative AI, is there anything you would point to there?
So I could be wrong about this. Maybe I'll see a case that changes my thinking. But my assumption has been that Section 230 offers essentially no protection for generative AI companies. They're the ones that went out and scraped large quantities of data that was never created specifically to be emitted from generative AIs. They have chosen to act as deliberate republishers of that. And I just don't think that fits either the text or the interpretation of Section 230. So my baseline is they can't point to it at all, and I do not see the courts changing the law in a way that would help them gain more protections from it. So I think they're operating in a world where they have to face tort liability.
That's been my understanding as well from various scholars, and I believe that the initial authors of Section 230 said that they did not contemplate such a thing. Of course, they did not contemplate what we have right now anyway. So, but I do think that's kind of been the baseline. There has been legislation that has been introduced that would confirm that would say definitively that Section 230 does not apply to generative AI.
Mm-hmm. In terms of other things that we might think about as we are approaching regulation going forward, something that came up this morning, it was actually a question submitted from the audience for one of the morning speakers, but the rights of the user when it comes to these tools, the rights of the user either to demand a different sort of interaction with the tool, that you want it to be a friend, or you want it to be an advisor, or you want it to be a neutral party. But the rights of the users vis-a-vis generative AI, I think, is not something that necessarily comes up that frequently in the policy conversation. But how, are there other areas of law or regulation we can point to where we do think a lot about, social media users' rights or things like that, or anything else you want to add there?
I'll start. I think when I think about this, I actually think about it in terms of the user's right to receive information and how that plays out in terms of our examination of a regulatory framework, for example, or trying to put strictures on what information is made available. And a lot of this discussion has been about trust, of course, but also about truth, right? The access to truth. And looking at the information ecosystem and the potential degradation of that ecosystem. I don't have an answer for how best to do that, but it's something that I've been thinking about in terms of the rights of the user.
Yeah, one analogy that might help that picks up on that is to think about professional speech. So my right to go to a doctor and receive medical advice that's tailored to my problems, or my ability to use the services of an engineer to help me with a design problem that I can't do on my own. And that comes in two flavors. There is the right to access services, that the government can't forbid me from getting expert help. Right to counsel is an example of that. And there's also the loyalty problem, that my lawyer can't be selling my information to the prosecution behind my back. The doctor has to actually be giving me advice in my best interests and not will make them the most money from the drug company. So those two sides, access and loyalty, help explain what the users really care about when they're going to a generative AI system.
Can I add one? So I think about, so there's a scholar at Columbia, Michael Judson, who has this, he talks about, what can news do for democracy? And he has this wonderful, and I use it all the time in classes, this teaching model that sort of says, well, is to provide information as a first pass, or provide analysis, or provide investigation, provide empathy, so you can figure out walk in somebody else's shoes, or maybe it's supposed to be a public forum, or maybe it's to mobilize action. And there's sort of these 6 things that are different things that news can do for democracy in different moments. And there's no one right answer to any one of those things. Sometimes you want information, sometimes you want empathy, mobilization, you want a mix. And with my sort of half glass full perspective, I'll say generative AI could be a way for journalists to think really differently maybe about the stories they're producing, and to think about different functions that news could serve. And that's sort of not a right of the user necessarily, but it's a benefit to the audience that really robust, reflexive uses of generative AI tools in news production could offer us a really sort of diverse way to think about what news could be. So it's not just one story that has to serve one particular function. There could be different functions of different stories. And so there's potential, I think, to sort of explode it all. Of course, I'd want that to happen with strong editorial oversight, with a really strong understanding of why these different stories were produced in different ways. But a harnessing of the generative AI tools could be an opening to do that. But it requires well-paid, lots of good journalists who are not struggling to just create 8 stories today because they have to do it.
Did you want to?
No, I was just thinking, I think about user rights, but within the safety context, where it brings a whole lot of other questions, right? Can I make sure that that others can't retrieve private information about me through interactions with the model? Can I make sure that a model can't generate harmful information about me? What do you make of the AI-enabled harassment, which is something that is absolutely already there? And I think those questions of user rights in the context of safety also feel fairly urgent. I think we're absolutely still working through that.
I'm going to turn to audience questions. Please continue to submitting them. These look great. Before I start doing that, I have one more question that has come up again in a few different contexts today, which has to do with the need for better communication across disciplines and the need for more work between disciplines. I think today's event has been a good example of that. Just to name a few of the different backgrounds that need to be in the conversation here: law, policy, computer science, the social sciences. James, I know you do a lot of work on this in terms of trying to get people to understand each other across disciplines in terms of convenings. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts you've made here, what you think we're going to need going forward? And what do you think lawyers and young technologists should be doing to prepare themselves to tackle these problems?
One of the things that makes me most optimistic about this is that there are actually lots of similarities between the way lawyers and technologists approach a problem. These are professions that do things with words and try actually to write things that convey their meaning really precisely. And one of the differences is that law is so endlessly open to interpretation and argument and debate, and technologists don't think that computer science is until they serve on a standards committee or are debating which product features or what rule to implement in a content filter. And that interchange comes out from the everyday practice of the communities. One of the things, basically I got involved in generative AI a year and a half ago because I had graduate students from machine learning who were interested in the legal dimensions. And in the process of having conversations with them where they would describe a system or a technical problem to me, and then we would try to think through the legal consequences, we originally started trying to write about the next generation of systems over the horizon. And then we realized, no, there was so much of a baseline of mutual conversation we needed to have that we needed to just write about what things looked like at the intersection from our own fields. That has turned into workshops and papers, but it really starts with people from different disciplines with mutual curiosity, trying to understand what each other know.
I know the rest of you also teach different groups of students. Do you have anything to add here in terms of what you think we need to be doing, either to prepare ourselves as educators or students who are preparing to enter these fields?
Can I jump in? Yeah, because this is my everyday bread and butter at USC with a lot of the groups that I work with there. And one phrase I tell the students sometimes is, sort of hold on to your discipline a little loosely and be able to step outside it, be able to reject it, know its history, know what its assumptions are, be able to see the language that it uses. And in some ways, I kind of don't care if you think of yourself as a lawyer or a technologist or a social scientist or humanist. What I've found happens is when people come together sometimes I try to talk about puzzles versus problems, because sometimes problems are they're weighted with this feeling of this is serious, but if you ground it in terms of puzzles and curiosity and playfulness, then it makes it, sometimes you can create more openings for different disciplines to meet. And right, I do a thing at USC when I have people introduce, and I say, you have to introduce yourself, but you have to do it in a way that I maybe can't tell what school you're coming from when we have these groups come around. Because everybody wants to say, I'm second year law school, whatever. And I'm like, no, try to just try to introduce yourself in a way that doesn't use that language. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but just the act of trying to step outside your disciplinary language and perspective, that alone, sometimes they go, oh, okay, there's a different puzzle that I might have.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of bringing playfulness to serious and sometimes intimidating problems. In my trust and safety class, we do a red teaming exercise where students are encouraged to go and poke at models and bypass safety safeguards and then have to submit reflections on what happened as a result of that. I was pretty sure that we were going to get a bunch of people banned. It didn't happen, so I'm knocking on wood. I have other questions about why it didn't happen, but that's a different story. I think that having this hands-on experience of, okay, let me try it, let me understand, let me poke at it, really, really helps them, assess the reality of what is a safeguard, how easy it is to bypass, what's working, what's not working in this area, but also, get the enthusiasm for the field. That being acknowledged, I have to say that I think some of the areas that we're touching on really still would benefit for more research and more baselining on these are the fundamentals of this field that you can work from. They are great scholarship already, thanks to people on this panel on content moderation, but still not enough that goes into the details of currently to date, how is this implemented? What systems are used? And it's not just scholarship, of course, right? This is transparency that we must also require from platforms. So it's, I think there's still a lot of work to do to properly do the documentation, contextualization, and transparency efforts that will continue to allow others to invent different and new systems.
Great. I'm going to add something here because as the research director at the Institute, I see this a lot, and there are people in this room who may be in a position to make this better. So the Academy needs to reward interdisciplinary work in a way that it does not currently. Right now, if you publish outside your discipline, it often counts less for you in terms of your ability to get promoted than it does if you publish in your home discipline. A lot of different disciplines don't seem to get the need for interdisciplinary work, although we're getting better at that. So one thing you can do if you're in a position to change that in your home institution is to try to change that and to encourage interdisciplinary work and to reward it appropriately to encourage younger scholars to do more of it.
+1. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask an interesting audience question because of the way it is framed. So the question is, do you foresee the next generation growing to trust AI-generated content more than it trusts human-generated content? If so, how can we avoid this? So one interesting thing here is the assumption that it's better for us to trust human-generated content than AI-generated content. Is that the case? Is it always going to be the case that AI-generated content is less than human-generated content? And sort of when does it matter? When does it matter to know whether it's human-generated or AI-generated? It's a very hard question, but we have a few minutes left, so why don't we try to get into it?
I laugh at this because I wonder if there was a moment where people had the same sort of struggle with a word processor, and you had to disclose whether you have used a word processor. And I think, in some ways, it is quite likely the case that people will work with generative AI in so many different ways. Does it matter if this is something that you've used to translate an input in a paper that you're writing? Does it matter if one sentence out of a text you're writing, you went back and forth with a generative AI tool to refine it? Or are we saying it only matters if it's substantially altered more than 60% of your document? Or is it 20? And in the case of an image, does it matter if you polished a grain of the picture? Or did, I think we don't have the, yet we don't have the frameworks in place to determine how are people going to work with these tools, and in which specific context and at what level are we going to say that this has different consequences for intellectual property, for different types of professional outputs? It's going to be interesting to find out, but that's only my word processor thoughts.
The little paper clip on that word perfect.
Clippy.
I didn't know how to name. I know how to name. I think that's exactly right. I don't think we have a frameworks for it yet. When I heard the question, I immediately thought about the next generation in my household, and the younger one isn't old enough to realize it yet. But the middle schooler is incredibly skeptical of all things having to do with things like social media, what you see online, that kind of thing. And so I see an actual shift there from what I've seen from people in between, say, the middle school age and my generation.
I think that, Camille, your points are exactly right, that we can't even draw a clean line between human-generated and AI-generated because there are so many pieces of it. Your camera in your phone has generative AI in it, which it uses to smooth out multiple exposures into a single coherent picture. And we don't even notice that anymore. And I think in addition to the difficulty of line drawing, creative practices in the future are going to be so strange and different that it's really hard to make predictions. We already have VTubers, who are people who wear essentially motion capture rigs and go and do online videos that are AI translated into animated characters of them. We had this at the Super Bowl with SpongeBob and Patrick doing announcing, and the announcers just did this, and people accepted that. Well, guess we have SpongeBob announcing the Super Bowl now. We barely know all of the strange things people will do with generative AI, and the very categories of human and AI will seem simple to us even a few years from now.
Can I just
Yes,
think
please.
really fast to say this exactly in my journalism class we talk about the pragmatic test of truth, right? Which is like, again, very American pragmatist philosophy. And the provocation I sometimes give to them, because these are journalism students who are like, very set on I'm going to tell the truth. And I totally believe them and trust them, and it's fine to do it. But I say, instead of only asking, is this proposition true? Instead of only asking that, also ask, what difference does it make in the world that you're able to perceive if that proposition is considered to be true, which is a very roundabout way to sort of make that construction. But what I think we need to do simultaneously is think about, yes, the truth quality of a proposition, but then the social power of that truth quality and the proposition and how it circulates and how it travels. And the only lasting point is I was double down absolutely on the artists with a colleague, Holly Willis at the USC Cinema School. We're starting a new project called AI for Media and Storytelling, and we've been giving these small grants to artists to basically say, try to break these tools. Try to do the most outrageous, provocative thing that you can, challenge the assumption that's been guiding your practice or your history of your profession, do something broken, do something really, and playful, in to that extent. So I'm a strong believer that the artists also have to be central to these conversations, not not the professional group that's impacted or affected by the technology. Let's get out of the effects language. The artists have to be in driver's seats as well, not just either suffering or benefiting from consequences of tech.
Okay, great. So in a minute, no, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to just add to that strong +1 for like us recentering the artists too. And I find it fascinating that even the first labor movements here come from those creative professions who say like, hey, wait a minute, we want to discuss what our labor practices are going to be here. So they're central in so many different ways. So yeah, just.
Great. We're coming towards the end, and I'm going to ask you all in a moment if you have any closing thoughts that you want to contribute to this group before we break for the day. But to give you a moment to think of that, I'm going to mash together a few different questions we've gotten from the audience Q&A, which all, as the way I'm interpreting them, all have to do with the Supreme Court and whether or not you all think they will see generative AI as sufficiently different from technologies that have come before that it merits a different kind of regulation. So traditionally, the First Amendment has been held to be a bar to all sorts of regulation of speech or speech platforms, things like that. And it seems like a lot of people want to know whether you all think or expect the court to look at generative AI differently or to try to use that same framework.
The Supreme Court is already more than one full generation behind in grappling with the technologies we already have. They have spent most of the last 25 years taking painfully few computer and internet cases, to the point they have not even developed a coherent theory of the technologies that came before generative AI. So until they start paying down that debt, I'm not confident about their ability to even compare generative AI to what we had 5 years ago.
It's a great point. Anyone else?
No, I think that's a really strong point, and I also think it points to the fact that the law is always behind, right? We know the law is always behind, but this feels like a gulf we have not seen previously, and I think that's disconcerting. I'll put it that way.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Okay, is there anything that you all would like to raise as we close out the day? Anything that occurred to you over the course of the day's discussions or that you want people to take with them going out of here?
Could I put in a big plug for just always consider the human and the non-human together, the tech and the people together, and try to catch yourself from talking about the effect of a technology on society. That would be my one big plea.
I would say today has been humbling in the best possible way because we're learning so much from one another. So I think that the import of the cross-collaboration, the cross-functionality, the cross-intellect is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the need to bridge across not just disciplines but also practices is going to be really reinforced. And I'm left thinking about the types of institutions like this one who allow us to create space for these discussions, playful spaces, spaces of curiosity, spaces of learning that are going to be critical as we navigate the gulfs, as you said, that separate us from being able to effectively govern these technologies, which is what we're talking about.
I want to put in another plug for Elizabeth Eisenstein's 2-volume history of the printing press and its culture it created, and to say, of the amazing transformations that she documents, from religion to science to new relations to text and to society, how few of them were or could have been predicted in the years immediately after the creation of print. They were at the beginning of a roller coaster ride they could barely imagine, so are we. And we're not going to get it all right anytime soon. We have to roll with the punches and learn as we see how our ways we use generative AI in society develop and change.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to give myself the last word as the moderator before we turn it over to Camille, and it is this. Anyone who works with me has heard me say this many times before, but There is a distinct tendency when we are talking about changing information environments and when we are talking about anything regarding disinformation and misinformation to make an assumption, even if you don't realize you're making it, that it used to be better, that somehow in the past people had better access to good information or were better able to deal with these problems, or that the news ecosystem was better. And what I would like to say is we all need to resist that temptation. It was not better before, it was just different. But this is not the first time we've ever dealt with a disruptive technology, and we shouldn't assume that we are ill-equipped to do so. And with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Camille and Shifu to close for us.